March 12, 1945. The Texas sun had already begun to rise over the endless tawny fields of Castro County, turning the barbed wire fences of Camp Hereford into glittering lines of fire. Dust swirled lazily in the morning air, and the smell of horses mixed with the scent of fresh cornbread from the camp's kitchen. For most of the guards and local workers, it was just another day at the prisoner of war camp that housed hundreds of captured Germans, men and women who had once served the collapsing Reich. But on that morning, something happened that would be remembered long after the war had ended, when a cowboy from Amarillo lifted a German woman POW onto his horse, and the entire camp fell silent. Her name was Hilda Kraus. She had been a Red Cross nurse in Munich before the war turned her world into rubble and ashes. By the time she was captured near the Moselle River in France in late 1944, she was no longer the confident young woman who had volunteered to serve her wounded countrymen. She was thin, weary, and haunted by the screams of men she couldn't save. When she arrived in Texas, the dry heat shocked her more than the captivity. The war had frozen Europe, but here, the air shimmered with light and life, yet she couldn't feel any of it. Every dawn felt like a punishment, every task like a reminder of what she had lost. That morning she was assigned to fetch buckets of water from the corral pump, a job normally done by the younger girls. Her shoes had worn through weeks earlier, and she walked barefoot on the hard earth, her pale feet striking against the dust and pebbles. Each step sent pain shooting through her soles. The guards said nothing to them. She was just another German prisoner. They had seen dozens like her, silent, resigned, ghosts of a broken Europe. But there was one man who noticed her differently. Tom Reynolds, a 29-year-old ranch hand from outside Amarillo, had been working at the camp since late 1943. The Army had hired local cowboys to help with livestock, construction, and agricultural work, since Texas soil was still being tilled even during the war. Tom had no military rank, just his hat, his boots, and his deep sense of right and wrong. His father had fought in the Great War, and told him that decency didn't stop at uniforms. You treat a man or a woman by their eyes, not their flag, his father used to say. Tom had carried those words like scripture. As Tom led his horse, Dusty, toward the water trough that morning, he saw Hilda stumble. The sun was already fierce, and she shielded her face with her hand, the sleeve of her gray uniform rolled up, her wrist thin as a twig. She was trying to lift a heavy bucket, but her legs trembled from exhaustion. For a moment she simply stopped, lowering her head as if she'd accepted defeat. Tom hesitated. He'd been warned more than once not to interact with the POWs, especially the women. The Army men were strict about maintaining order, but the sight before him wasn't about politics or orders. It was about humanity. He stepped closer, the leather of his boots crunching against the gravel. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his southern drawl soft but steady. "You're gonna hurt yourself." Hilda didn't respond. Her English was fragile, and she was too used to being ignored to think he was talking to her kindly. She muttered something in German, perhaps an apology, and tried again to lift the bucket. The water sloshed over the rim, soaking the hem of her skirt. Tom looked at her for a long moment, then exhaled as if deciding something against his better judgment. He handed the reins of Dusty to a nearby private and stepped forward. "Hold up," he said. And before anyone could stop him, he bent down, scooped Hilda gently by the waist, and lifted her onto the saddle. The sound of his boots hitting the dirt echoed like a gunshot. The entire yard froze. A few guards turned their heads, their expressions twisting from confusion to disbelief. One even dropped his cigarette. The prisoners working nearby stared, murmuring in German. Tom didn't seem to notice them. He reached up, adjusted her foot in the stirrup, and said, "There now, you'll burn your feet off out here." Hilda's heart pounded. She clutched the saddle horn, staring down at him, unable to speak. No man, certainly no American, had touched her since her capture. She had expected cruelty, humiliation, distance. Not this. The feel of the horse beneath her, the unexpected kindness of the cowboy, broke something inside her that had been locked for too long. A lieutenant by the gate barked, "Reynolds, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" Tom looked up, squinting against the sun. "She's barefoot," he said simply. "Ain't no harm in letting her ride to the pump." "That's not your decision, son," the officer snapped, striding forward. "You can't just..." Let the sergeant beside him, an older man named Carter, who'd seen the same scene, put a hand on his shoulder. "Let it go, Lieutenant," he murmured. "She's just fetching water. Ain't like he's taking her to town." The young officer scowled, but didn't press the issue. Still, whispers began to ripple through the camp. By noon, everyone had heard it. The cowboy put the German woman on his horse. Some said it was foolish. Others said it was gallant. For Hilda it was something else entirely. She rode quietly beside him, as Dusty trotted toward the corral. The wind lifted strands of her hair, and she felt the sun's warmth on her face. For the first time in months, she wasn't just surviving, she was existing. She turned slightly toward Tom and managed a faint, trembling smile. "Danke," she whispered. Tom nodded. "You're welcome," he said softly, not sure if she understood. When they reached the pump, he dismounted and offered her his hand. She took it, hesitantly, her fingers cold despite the heat. As she slid down, her feet touched the ground lightly and she steadied herself. For a brief second, they stood close, two people from worlds at war sharing a silence that said more than any speech. Then Tom stepped back, tipping his hat. "You take care now," he said, leading the horse away. Hilda watched him walk toward the stables, his figure fading into the golden dust. Something inside her chest stirred. Not romantic, but profoundly human. A flicker of memory that perhaps not all men had forgotten how to be kind. That afternoon, the gossip reached the mess hall, the barracks, and even the command office. Some American guards chuckled about the cowboy gentleman. Others warned that such behavior could cause trouble. The German prisoners, however, whispered about it differently. They called him der Cowboy mit Herz, the cowboy with a heart. For them it was a story of dignity, proof that their captors could still act with compassion in a time when compassion had nearly vanished from the world. When the sun set that evening, Camp Hereford seemed quieter. The guards smoked their cigarettes under the porch lamps. Somewhere, a harmonica played a slow tune. Hilda sat by the window of the women's barracks, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of water. She looked out across the fields, where horses grazed beyond the fence. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and violet, and she thought of home, the green meadows near Munich, her mother's garden before the bombings, the laughter that once filled the kitchen. And then she thought of the cowboy, the way he had lifted her as if she mattered, as if she wasn't invisible anymore. Her throat tightened. In her mind she could still feel the warmth of his hands, the steady breathing of the horse beneath her, the brief return of something she thought had died. Truck. Outside, the night wind blew across the plains, carrying with it the faint sound of a whippoorwill. The world was still at war. Europe was still burning. And yet in that corner of Texas, something small but significant had happened. An act of grace that neither nation's propaganda could explain. The next morning, the camp would continue as usual. Orders would be given, fences guarded, rations counted. But for those who had seen what happened, for those who had felt the silence that followed when a cowboy lifted a German woman POW onto his horse, something had quietly changed inside them. And though no one said it aloud, they all sensed it. That moment had shown them a truth the war itself had tried to bury. Even in the midst of captivity, the soul can still recognize kindness when it sees it. March 14, 1945. 2 days had passed since that quiet scene in the corral, and yet Camp Hereford hadn't stopped murmuring about it. The cowboy and the German nurse had become an unspoken legend in the middle of nowhere. The officers pretended to ignore it, the guards pretended it didn't matter, and the prisoners pretended not to talk about it, but everyone did. The story spread from one barrack to another, from kitchen to workshop, carried on whispers and glances that spoke of something rare, decency in a time of barbed wire and war. Hilde Kraus awoke before sunrise, as she always did, to the clang of the morning bell. The women's barracks were cold even in the Texas heat, built of thin planks that let the dawn light creep through the cracks. She dressed quietly, her movements soft, precise, like a nurse in a ward. Around her the others stirred. Anna, the baker's daughter from Bremen, Greta, the interpreter who spoke English with a thick accent, and Liesel, the youngest, who still cried sometimes at night. They had all heard about the cowboy, and though they said little to Hilde directly, she could feel their curious eyes on her. When she stepped outside, the air smelled of mesquite and early morning dust. The sound of boots, horses, and distant radio static filled the yard. The guards shouted orders in English. The prisoners replied in hesitant, "Yes, sir." For Hilde, the routine was numbing. Line up, count, report, work. Yet since that brief ride on the horse, the world around her looked slightly different. The sun didn't seem so harsh. The wind didn't cut as sharply against her skin. Something within her had softened, though she couldn't name it. Tom Reynolds hadn't spoken to her since that day. He was back to his chores, tending to the horses, fixing fences, and delivering feed to the camp kitchen. But every time she passed near the corral, she could feel his presence. Not in a romantic sense, but in a quiet awareness, or recognition between two souls who had shared a forbidden moment of humanity. That morning, she was reassigned to the infirmary barrack, a low, whitewashed building with wide windows and the smell of iodine and soap. The American sergeant who supervised her, an older man named Carter, seemed kinder than most. He had been in North Africa, had seen the worst of war, and no longer believed in cruelty as a form of discipline. "You were a nurse in Germany, weren't you?" he asked her in slow English, his voice more curious than commanding. Hilda nodded. "Yes, sir. I was Krankenschwester." Carter gave a small smile. "Well, sister, we can use steady hands around here. Just don't faint at the sight of blood." That morning, she cleaned cuts, handed out aspirin, and helped dress the wounds of both German prisoners and American personnel who had small farm accidents. A broken finger, a cut hand, a sprained ankle. Her calmness and precision impressed even the skeptical guards. When a young American private accidentally spilled boiling water on his wrist, Hilda reacted instantly. She grabbed a towel, poured cool water, and wrapped his arm with gauze before he could even cry out. The sergeant watched, arms crossed, saying nothing. When she finished, he nodded approvingly. "You've done this before?" "Yes," she said simply. "In France, in field hospitals." He didn't ask which side she treated. He didn't need to. Later that afternoon, as she stepped outside for air, the wind carried the smell of hay and horse sweat from the nearby stables. The sun glared low in the western sky, burning orange behind the wire fences. Tom was there again, adjusting Dusty's saddle straps. His hat tipped low, his sleeves rolled up. The horse neighed softly when Hilda approached, recognizing her scent. She hesitated at the fence, unsure if she should speak. But Tom noticed her anyway. He gave her a small nod, not quite a smile but something close. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said quietly. She didn't know if she was allowed to respond, so she just offered a faint smile and said, "The horse. He remembers." Tom chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Dusty's got a good memory. He don't forget a kind face." She blushed slightly, looking down. Her English was limited, but she caught the meaning. The air between them held a strange gentleness, the kind that didn't belong in a camp surrounded by rifles and barbed wire. They stood in silence for a few seconds, until Sergeant Carter's voice broke the spell. "Reynolds, you done fixing that gate?" Tom tipped his hat toward Hilda. "Guess I better go, miss." "Goodbye," she said softly, the word foreign but sincere. That evening, as the sky turned purple and the first stars appeared, the camp buzzed with small talk. The guards gathered near the canteen, drinking coffee and telling jokes about home. The German prisoners cooked their rations, beans, cornmeal, and sometimes, if they were lucky, pieces of meat traded from the kitchen. Hilda sat by the open window again, looking at the horizon. She heard a harmonica somewhere, playing a tune that sounded like both longing and peace. Inside the camp, life was hard but predictable. Yet the war outside was nearing its violent end. Radio broadcasts from Washington said Germany was collapsing. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. Hitler's speeches had gone silent. But inside Camp Hereford, the prisoners didn't cheer or curse, they just waited. Waiting had become their way of living. Tom, meanwhile, was restless. That single act, lifting Hilda onto his horse, had stirred something in him that didn't sit easy. He wasn't in trouble officially, though a young lieutenant had scolded him. "You treat them too kindly, Reynolds," the officer said. "They're still the enemy." Tom had nodded but didn't argue. In his heart, he couldn't see enemies anymore. Not after seeing the way those women lived. Quiet, obedient, half-starved yet still composed. He'd seen hatred before, in men's eyes after bar fights or cattle disputes. But what he saw in that German nurse's eyes wasn't hate. It was exhaustion, sorrow, the kind that comes from seeing too much death. That night, he lay awake in his bunkhouse, the ceiling fan clicking above him. The desert wind rattled the window shutters. He thought about his younger brother, killed in Italy in 19. He thought about the letter his mother had sent after the funeral. "Son, don't let war make you forget who you are." He hadn't understood those words until now. Over the next few days, he found excuses to pass near the infirmary. Sometimes he carried water barrels. Sometimes he brought hay. Each time he'd catch a glimpse of Hilda through the window, her bent over a cot, cleaning a wound, her movements graceful and calm. She never smiled much, but when she did, it was small and fleeting, like sunlight breaking through cloud. On March 18, a dust storm swept across the plains. The wind howled all afternoon, turning the camp into a blur of brown and gold. Tents flapped, men cursed, and the guards shouted over the noise. Inside the infirmary, Hilda helped secure the shutters. When one of them broke loose, she tried to fasten it, but the wind caught the frame, and the sharp edge cut her palm. Tom, who had been nearby with the stable crew, rushed over when he heard the commotion. He saw her standing by the door, clutching her bleeding hand. Without thinking, he stepped inside against every rule. "You're bleeding," he said, taking her hand before she could protest. He tore a strip from his handkerchief and wrapped it around the wound. "You gotta be careful with these old boards." She stared at him, speechless, her eyes bright with both surprise and confusion. "Why? You help," she whispered in broken English. Tom tied the knot gently and shrugged. "Guess it's just what decent folks do." The wind roared outside, slamming the shutters. For a brief moment the two of them stood in the dim light of the infirmary. The world outside reduced to noise and dust. It felt like time itself had paused. When Sergeant Carter entered a minute later, Tom stepped back quickly, removing his hat. The sergeant looked at them both, then at the bloody rag on her hand and sighed. "She all right?" "Yes, sir," Tom said. Cut her hand on the window frame. Carter nodded, understanding more than he said. "All right then. Get back to your horses, Reynolds." "Yes, sir." He left without looking back, but Hildy stood there long after he was gone, her bandaged hand trembling slightly. She pressed her fingers to the cloth and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: safety. That night, she wrote in her small notebook, one she'd hidden from the guards since her capture. Her handwriting was shaky, but her words were steady. "Heute hat der Cowboy mir geholfen. Ist freundlich. Vielleicht ist nicht alles verloren." Today the cowboy helped me. He is kind. Perhaps not all is lost. Outside the storm passed, leaving the air cool and the moon pale above the plains. Camp Hereford fell silent again, except for the sound of a horse neighing in the distance. In that silence, something invisible lingered. Not romance, not rebellion, but the fragile thread of understanding between two worlds that war had torn apart. And while the war raged across the Atlantic, in that small corner of Texas, a cowboy and a captive had quietly begun to prove that even when nations crumble, kindness can still hold the line. April 4, 1945. The Texas wind carried the scent of spring, mingled with the dry dust of the plains and the faint hum of distant engines. The war in Europe was collapsing. Everyone could feel it. Even inside Camp Hereford, newspapers passed from hand to hand among the guards. Stories of American tanks rolling through Germany, of cities in ruins, of Hitler's generals surrendering one by one. The prisoners, especially the women, didn't cheer and didn't cry. They listened quietly, eyes lowered, their thoughts somewhere across the ocean, in the shattered towns they once called home. By now Hilda Kraus had become a familiar face in the camp infirmary. She moved like clockwork, cleaning wounds, distributing quinine, washing linen, and bandaging injuries that came from barbed wire or mishandled tools. Her English was improving, and though she spoke little, her calm manner had begun to soften even the hardest guards. That German nurse, they called her. "She's got hands like a saint," but to some she was still the enemy. There were whispers that she had tended to German soldiers who fought Americans, that her presence was a reminder of the blood spilled overseas. Tom Reynolds heard those whispers too. He ignored them. Since the day of the storm, when he had wrapped her hand, he had tried to keep his distance. The officers were watching him closely. Yet every time he passed the infirmary, his eyes drifted toward the window, searching for a glimpse of her. He didn't understand why. Maybe it was because she carried herself with a kind of quiet dignity he hadn't seen in a long time. Not since his brother's funeral, when his mother had stood straight and silent as the flag was folded into her hands. That morning Tom was assigned to the outer pasture with 2 soldiers and a truck full of feed. The fence had broken overnight, and the cattle were wandering too close to the perimeter. It was long, back-breaking work, mending posts, hammering wire, and keeping the animals calm under the rising sun. Around noon, as he took a break near the stables, he saw Sergeant Carter walking toward him. The man's face looked more serious than usual. "Reynolds," Carter said, removing his hat and wiping sweat from his forehead. "Command wants a few of the POW women to help with the infirmary expansion. They'll need extra hands to carry supplies. You'll escort them to the work area." Tom nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. Who am I taking?" "4 of them. And the nurse, Kraus. You know her." Tom's stomach tightened, though he kept his expression steady. "Understood, sir." By afternoon the sun blazed over the yard as the group of women was led from the barracks, Hildy among them, her gray uniform slightly cleaner than before, her hair tied back neatly. She didn't look at Tom at first, but when she saw he would be escorting them, her eyes flickered with something like relief. They worked together near the southern fence, hauling wooden crates filled with blankets, medicine bottles, and tools. Tom gave orders softly, respectful but firm. The guards stood nearby, rifles slung over their shoulders, bored but alert. At one point Hildy tripped slightly on a stone, her arms full of gauze boxes. Tom reached out instinctively to steady her. Their hands met briefly, and she froze, startled. He quickly stepped back, glancing toward the guards. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said, her voice faint but composed. "Thank you." For a moment their eyes met, and the noise of the camp faded away. Around them, the wind picked up, lifting the edge of her scarf, making it dance like a ghost of peace neither of them could name. Then she returned to work, and he turned away, pretending to fix a crate. Later that evening, while the others rested, Tom brought Dusty to the corral for watering. The air was cool, the sky painted with streaks of gold and lavender. As he brushed the horse's mane, he saw Hildy again, this time walking alone near the infirmary fence, carrying a bucket. Her posture was tired, but her steps were measured. He watched her quietly, unsure if he should call out. "Evening, ma'am," he finally said. She stopped, turned, and for a second looked startled. Then she smiled, a small, weary smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Evening," she echoed softly. Tom nodded toward the bucket. "You need help with that?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "It is not heavy." He walked closer, keeping a polite distance. "You've been working long hours." "Yes, but it keeps mind busy," she replied, struggling with the English words. "Better than thinking too much." He understood that too well. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Thinking's dangerous out here." For a while they stood there, the silence between them easy and unspoken. Dusty nickered softly, nudging the fence. Hilda reached out hesitantly and stroked the horse's nose. Her fingers trembled slightly. "He is good animal," she said. "Best horse I ever had," Tom said. "You like horses?" "In Germany my uncle had one. Before war." Her voice faltered, and she looked away. "He died in bombing." Tom wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but the words caught in his throat. He simply tipped his hat and said, "I'm sorry." She nodded once, whispering, "Thank you." The light faded slowly, and the first stars appeared. For a brief moment, it felt as if they were the only two people in the world. But that fragile calm broke when the sound of boots approached. Lieutenant Harris, young, sharp-faced, and always looking for trouble, strode toward them. "Reynolds," he barked. "What's going on here?" Tom turned, straightening. "Just watering my horse, sir." The lieutenant's gaze shifted to Hilde. "And what's she doing outside the designated area?" "She was fetching water for the infirmary, sir," Tom said evenly. "I just asked if she needed help." Harris frowned, his lips curling slightly. "Seems like you've got a soft spot for the enemy, Reynolds." Tom's jaw tightened. "Just doing my job, sir." "Make sure that's all you're doing." The officer turned to Hilde. "You back to your quarters now." Hilde bowed her head slightly. "Yes, sir," she said, retreating quickly, her face pale. Tom watched her walk away, his hands clenched at his sides. The lieutenant lingered a moment longer, then spat into the dirt and walked off. That night Tom couldn't sleep. He sat outside the bunkhouse, smoking quietly, watching the moon climb high over the desert. The camp was silent except for the distant hum of a generator. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, yet he felt trapped by rules, by appearances, by the unspoken line between guard and prisoner. But he couldn't erase the image of her face under the fading light, or the way she had looked at him, not with fear but with something gentler, something that asked to be seen. Days passed. The tension around the camp grew heavier. Reports came in that the war might end soon, but nobody celebrated. The guards worried about riots, the prisoners about what waited for them back home. One afternoon, the Red Cross arrived, officers in khaki, their notebooks filled with questions. They interviewed the POWs, checking for mistreatment. When Hilde's turn came, they asked her in German, "Sind Sie gut behandelt worden?" "Have you been treated well?" She paused, thinking of the long days, the hunger, the fear, and then of that moment when a cowboy had lifted her onto his horse, when someone had looked at her and seen more than a prisoner. "Yeah," she said softly. "We are treated with respect." The officer nodded and made a note. That evening, Sergeant Carter pulled Tom aside near the stables. "You're not in trouble," he said gruffly, lighting a cigarette. "But word is, the lieutenant wants to file a formal complaint about your conduct." Tom frowned. "Conduct? For what?" "For being human, I guess," Carter muttered. Listen, Reynolds. Don't give him any more excuses. Just do your work and stay clear of the prisoners. War's almost over, don't let this mess your record. Tom nodded reluctantly. Yes, sir. Carter looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, For what it's worth, son, you did right. Ain't no law against kindness. That night, Hildy sat at her desk in the dim barrack, her hands folded around her bandaged palm. The infirmary was quiet now. She opened her small notebook again and wrote, Schaut mich an, als wäre ich noch Mensch. He looks at me as if I am still human. April 8, 1945. A military photographer arrived at Camp Hereford to document life inside the compound. The army wanted to show that German prisoners were being treated humanely. To send proof to Washington and to the world, he took photographs of the kitchens, the workstations, the classrooms where prisoners learned English. And then in the late afternoon, as he walked toward the stables, he saw something that caught his eye. A cowboy leading a horse beside a German nurse. The light was golden, falling across their faces, the horse's mane glowing like silk. The woman was smiling faintly, her hand brushing the animal's neck. The man stood beside her, quiet, watchful. The photographer raised his camera, clicked the shutter, and captured the moment. No one said anything, but the photo would later circulate through military offices as a symbol of American decency. A cowboy and a prisoner sharing a moment of peace beneath the Texas sun. That night, Tom found a note hidden near the fence line, folded neatly under a small stone. He looked around before picking it up. The handwriting was delicate, uncertain. Kindness is not weakness. Do not be sorry for being kind. He read it twice, his throat tight. He didn't know how she had managed to leave it there without being seen, and he didn't care. He folded it carefully, placed it in his pocket, and stared at the horizon where the stars were beginning to appear. Far away, across the ocean, Berlin was burning. The war was dying, but in the quiet fields of Texas, something else was being born. A fragile reminder that even when the world loses its soul, two strangers can still recognize it in each other. May 12, 1945. The wind over the Texas plains carried a strange silence, the kind that comes after thunder. The war in Europe was finally over. The radios in Camp Hereford had confirmed it days earlier. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. For the Americans, there was relief, even celebration, but also confusion about what would come next. For the German prisoners, it wasn't celebration at all, just stunned quiet. They were no longer soldiers or captives of war. They were something else now, something in between. Displaced people waiting to be sent home to a homeland that no longer existed in the same shape it once had. The morning sun was warm, and the camp moved slowly like a town after a storm. The guards were more relaxed. Some even laughed again. The fences still stood, but the tension behind them had softened. Hilde Kraus stood near the infirmary steps, her thin fingers resting against the wooden railing as she looked toward the western fields. Beyond the fences, the grass rippled under the wind, golden and endless. It reminded her of the wheat fields outside Munich. When she was a girl, for a moment she could almost forget where she was. But the war had changed everything. Letters had begun arriving from Europe, carried through the Red Cross. Letters filled with grief and uncertainty. Some prisoners learned their families were alive. Others found out their homes had been bombed into dust. When Hilde received her first letter in months, it was from an old neighbor. The handwriting was shaky, the paper smudged. Your parents' house is gone, it read. Your mother has not been seen since January. She sat on her bunk for hours reading the lines again and again until they blurred. That afternoon, Sergeant Carter visited the barracks to inform the women of their transfer orders. You'll be heading to the port in a few weeks, he said gently. From there, ships will take you back to Europe. Most likely to Bremen or Le Havre, depending on where you're from. Hilde listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Around her, the other women whispered in disbelief. Home. The word no longer had meaning. What home? What streets? What country? That night, Hilde couldn't sleep. The Texas night was still and soft. The moonlight spilling through the barrack slats. She opened her small notebook and wrote, her thoughts drifting like smoke. He will not know, but I will miss the kindness. The way he looked at me without judgment, the way he helped when others would not. Tom Reynolds had spent the evening sitting on the fence outside the stables, a cigarette glowing faintly between his fingers. The sound of distant laughter came from the guards' quarters. Someone had brought a radio and was playing swing music. But he didn't feel like celebrating. The war was over, yes, but what did it mean? He had lost friends, his brother, and years of peace. The world might have stopped fighting, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like aftermath. He thought of Hilde often, though he hadn't spoken to her much since the lieutenant's warning. Every time he passed the infirmary, he saw her working, calm and steady. Her presence had become part of the camp's rhythm, like the sound of the windmill or the creak of saddle leather. Now, knowing she would soon be gone, something in him felt heavier than before. On May 15, a transport truck arrived from Amarillo, carrying Red Cross officials and supplies for the departing prisoners. Tom helped unload crates under the afternoon sun. The camp buzzed with new energy. Lists were checked, documents signed, and suitcases inspected. Hilde helped the infirmary staff pack bandages and medicine that would travel with the returning group. She worked quietly, her face pale from lack of sleep. Later, as she walked near the stables carrying a box of blankets, she saw Tom tightening Dusty's reins. He looked up, surprised to see her so close. For a moment, neither spoke. The sunlight reflected off the horse's coat, and the warm air shimmered between them. "You're leaving soon," Tom said finally, breaking the silence. "Yes," she answered softly. "Sergeant said next week." He nodded, tightening the saddle strap to avoid her gaze. "Guess that's good news." Hilde hesitated. "Yes, but I don't know where I go now." Tom looked at her then, really looked at the weariness in her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands, the quiet sadness she carried like a shadow. "You'll be all right," he said gently. "You've got strength. The kind that don't fade easy." She smiled faintly. "You sound sure." "I've seen it," he said almost to himself. For a while neither moved. The camp noises, the clatter of tin cups, the distant murmur of prisoners, the low whinny of a horse, seemed to fade into the background. Hilde set down the box and brushed her hands on her skirt. "Do you still ride the horse every day?" she asked softly, her accent curling around the words. "Every morning," Tom replied. "He don't like to rest. Gets restless like the wind." She nodded slowly, then looked at him. "May I see?" He blinked, surprised, but then gave a small grin. "Reckon one more ride couldn't hurt." They waited until late afternoon, when the guards changed shifts, and the camp was quiet. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the corral. Tom led Dusty out, his boots stirring dust from the ground. Hilde stood by the fence, hesitant, glancing around to be sure no one saw. Tom placed his hand on the saddle, his tone half playful, half serious. "You remember how to sit proper?" She smiled, almost shy. "I think I remember." He offered his hand. She took it without hesitation this time, and he lifted her up, the same way he had that morning in March. Her breath caught, the motion stirring a wave of memory, the heat, the smell of leather, the steady strength of his arm. For a second it felt like time folded back on itself. The camp was silent, except for the creak of the saddle and the soft snort of the horse. Tom led Dusty in slow circles, the fading sunlight washing everything in gold. Hilde held onto the reins, her eyes half closed, her lips parted slightly in awe. "It feels free," she whispered. Tom nodded, looking up at her. "Freedom starts here," he said, tapping his chest. For a while they didn't speak. The horse moved steady and calm, the world shrinking to that small circle of dirt under the Texas sky. Beyond the fences, the horizon stretched out endless, unscarred by war. But their quiet moment didn't last. A guard spotted them from the tower and shouted something. Tom stopped immediately, helping her down before trouble could escalate. The guard didn't approach. He only shook his head, muttering about fool cowboys and soft hearts. But the moment was broken. Hilda stood before Tom, brushing dust from her skirt, her eyes filled with something she couldn't hide. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Tom looked down, his throat tightening. "Ain't nothing to thank me for, ma'am." "Yes," she insisted, her voice trembling. "There is. You showed me people can still be good, even when the world is not." He didn't know what to say. Words felt useless in that kind of silence. So he simply tipped his hat and gave her the faintest smile. "You take care, Miss Krause." She smiled sadly. "Goodbye, Cowboy." When the trucks came a few days later, the prisoners lined up by the gate, their belongings in small canvas bags. The American flag fluttered above them, and the dust rose as engines roared to life. Tom stood near the fence, his hat pulled low, watching the column move. Hilda sat in the back of one of the trucks, surrounded by faces she barely knew. She searched the crowd, and found him. Their eyes met across the distance, across the barbed wire, across everything that divided their worlds. She raised her hand slightly, Small wave. Tom touched the brim of his hat in return. Neither smiled. It wasn't a farewell that needed words. The truck began to move, and soon she was gone, a gray figure swallowed by the road and the endless plains beyond. The days that followed felt heavier. The camp grew emptier as the POWs departed in waves. Tom kept to his work, fixing fences, tending to the horses, pretending it didn't matter. But every time he passed the corral, he remembered that moment, her hand on the saddle, her quiet voice saying thank you, the way the light had caught in her hair. Months later, when the camp finally closed and the last prisoners were sent away, Tom packed his things to return to his family's ranch. As he cleaned out his bunk, a folded piece of paper fell from between his shirts. It was the note she had written months earlier, the one he had kept in his pocket. Kindness is not weakness. Do not be sorry for being kind. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time reading the words again and again. Then he folded it carefully, placed it in his wallet, and rode home. Years passed. The war became a memory told in books and photographs. The photo the army photographer had taken that April, of the cowboy and the German nurse beside a horse, found its way into a Texas museum. Visitors would stop and stare at it, struck by its quietness. No battle, no violence, just two people standing in sunlight, bound by something simple and human. No one knew their names. The caption read only, Camp Hereford, Texas, 1945, POW program. But for those who looked closely, the picture told more than history. It told of a moment when war forgot itself, when a soldier's son and a captured nurse shared a truth larger than victory or surrender, that dignity and mercy can outlive any flag or empire. And though the years would carry them to different corners of the world, though their paths would never cross again, the plains of Texas would remember, the fences would rust away, the horses would be gone, but the wind that swept across that empty land would still whisper the same quiet truth, that once, in the heart of war, a cowboy lifted a woman onto his horse, and in that fleeting act, humanity took a breath again.